Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. There was considerable outside involvement in the Vietnam War, with support for the Viet Cong from both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, and support for the American war effort coming from the likes of Australia as well as others. But it wasn't on the scale of the Korean War, and I thought it would be useful for you if we had a presentation focusing on that. American involvement in Korea was every bit as significant as that in Vietnam. President Truman responded immediately to Kim Il-sung's aggression, sending advisors, some troops as well as supplies, and dispatching American warships. And America sponsored the UN resolutions, sending more troops to Korea immediately after the second UN resolution had been passed. Eventually, another 15 member states, including Britain, sent troops. Another 10 countries provided non-military assistance, mostly medical care. But America provided 89% of UN troops, 86% of the naval power, and 93% of the air power. What's more, the UN troops were led by the American General MacArthur. He took his orders from and reported to President Truman, not the UN, though the UN received his reports after the President had read them. But the Korean War is of particular interest in the history of the Cold War because there was direct UN involvement. Consequently, why, as well as to what extent and to what effect did the UN get involved, are important questions specific to this topic. The UN General Secretary, Tragve Lai, called an emergency meeting of the Security Council on the day of the DPRK's invasion, which passed the first resolution, introduced by the American delegation, calling for the DPRK to withdraw its troops immediately. When the DPRK ignored the UN, the second resolution was passed just 2 days later, recommending intervention by the international community. A third resolution passed a little over a week after the second, put the international force under a single American command. These resolutions committed UN member states to military action. They were able to be passed because the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN, in protest to the fact that the People's Republic of China was not recognized, and China was still being represented by the nationalist government that had fled to Taiwan, rather than by Mao's government in Beijing. Yet Stalin was aware of Kim Il-sung's invasion plans, and so the likelihood of the UN response, which begs the question, why still boycott the UN and so deny himself the chance to use the Soviet veto? In August, the Soviet Union's delegation returned to the UN and immediately used its veto in the Security Council to thwart further UN action. As a consequence, though, America put forward a resolution to the General Assembly known as Uniting for Peace, that handed responsibility for peacekeeping to the General Assembly if the UN was unable to act because of a veto in the Security Council. There was no veto in the General Assembly. It was controversial, but it worked, even if it would later be repeatedly used against American interests. So it was that the West fought as a UN force. The Soviet Union accused Tragve Lai of bias in favour of America and of acting beyond the scope of his office. Their delegation refused to work with him, and his position became impossible. In 1953, he decided to resign, and the UN as a neutral arbiter in international affairs was brought into question. Now, when we are looking at the Soviet Union's involvement in the war, we must not forget that Stalin, after first saying no, did give his blessing to Kim's invasion. Kim Il-sung first approached Stalin about uniting Korea in early 1949, but the timing wasn't right. The Soviet Union was embroiled in the Berlin blockade. But a year later, emboldened by the Soviet bomb and by Mao's victory in the Chinese Civil War, Stalin could see only advantages if Korea was united, and no great cost to the Soviet Union if the venture failed. On top of that, the DPRK's army was largely equipped by the Soviet Union, and many of its troops had undergone training there. And during the war, the Soviet Union also provided the Chinese with pilots, as well as planes, the MiG-15, which was superior, faster, and with greater firepower than anything the Americans had at the time. But Stalin had given Kim his blessing only on the proviso that the Soviet Union would not get dragged into the war, and they didn't. But we are still left wondering why Stalin didn't block those first UN resolutions. Did he want a war that wouldn't harm the Soviet Union, but just might cause problems for America? Turning to the PRC, they wanted to avoid a direct confrontation with America. The Chinese Civil War had only just been won, and the PRC was in a very poor state. It certainly didn't have the resources for a major war. But when the UN forces got to within 100 kilometers of the Yalu River and the PRC's border, despite Mao's warning not to, and they had reasons to be concerned, MacArthur had wanted to use nuclear weapons on China. Well, the PRC felt compelled to act, and a force of heavily armed volunteers, initially numbering somewhere between 200 and 300,000, but rising to over 1 million, entered the fray. The Chinese fought as volunteers so that the PRC was not officially involved, just as America fought as a UN force. But it was the People's Liberation Army, trained and armed by the PRC. And the size of the Chinese volunteers force was such that it proved a turning point in the war. And in the third phase of the war, the UN American troops were swept back, and it was the turn of Chinese troops to cross the 38th parallel, Seoul again falling to the Communists. It would end up back at the 38th parallel, but still, North Korea remained communist. So, I hope this proves useful for you. Good luck with your studies, and thanks so much for listening. Don't forget my other stuff, my website, History Made Easier, and my ebooks on Amazon, and you may be interested in tutorials. Just get in touch, or get your parents to get in touch at historymadeeasier@gmail.com. Oh, and there's also my podcast, Making Sense of This Crazy World, if you're really interested in history. But for now, cheers.